able to talk to you, for expanding our roots. It's just great to be able to speak to you on this last full week of Black History Month.
Yes.
And so the last full week of February, which has felt like a crazy, crazy month. We've had the winter storms. We've had, yesterday, I heard this story about a plane that was headed from Denver to Honolulu that had to make an emergency landing, and the plane was falling apart as it was in the air. Like, so much has happened this month. It's a lot that's going on.
We're here today together, the 56th anniversary of Malcolm X's assassination.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, a couple days ago, one of the FBI, I believe, or NYCPD informants um, read a letter that basically was like, yeah, we were majorly involved in this, in the assassination of X. So yeah, we are here, and life is still very much creating opportunities, but also creating conflicts that we try to figure out how to manage. So I'm glad to be here with you.
Thank you for sharing that historical piece with me. I knew that today was connected to Malcolm X, but I did not know specifically why. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that piece of information with me. But speaking of the past, that's our past as Black people, but I want to go to your past specifically. When I do interviews, I always start with a question that kind of takes you all the way back to the beginning of everybody's journey. And that is my favorite, one of my favorite questions to ask. That is the "where are you from" question. So where are you from?
Where am I from? Well, if we want to get technical, I'm from my father's. Okay.
Where are you from geographically?
Where am I from geographically? That's a very simple question, but it also feels like it's layered for me. I was born in Austin, Texas. Before I turned one, my parents moved to New York City. And then before I turned 13, after my parents split up, my mom moved us. She was the custodial parent. So she moved herself and her kids to central Louisiana. And so I always tell people I'm from Alexandria. I tell people I'm like a Southern Yankee hybrid. I'm very much a Southern girl at heart. But then you catch me in the wrong alleyway and the Bronx comes out just like I'm Jennifer Lopez.
What I'm hearing is that you're local in many different places.
Yes.
So how does it feel to have all these different places, I guess, have an influence on you as a person? Because a lot of the people that I've interviewed, they'll say straightforward, I'm from Belgium, I'm from Baton Rouge, I'm from Scotlandville, I'm from France, I'm from Miami. And you're saying that you basically have had all these different places in very different regions of the country shape who you are.
You know, it's so interesting because so right after grad school, I actually moved back to Austin because prior to grad school, I called it the city of my heart. I was like, I'm gonna move back to where I was born, to where it all started, and I hated it, right? And I think the thing that really made that challenging for me is because there was a high level of expectation about how progressive Austin was, right? Like the tagline of the city is "Keep Austin Weird," you know. So I was expecting like this vibrant culture, and that was there, but I was expecting like this move, this like political force field of people creating change, you know, stirred in the streets, you know, having critical conversations. And all I saw were people who were super concerned about how organic the vegetables were, right? And the Whole Foods, as opposed to no one talking about the very present redlining that was going on, right? So I was like, ooh, this is not a vibe. Um, and so I think maybe one of the benefits from like living, um, kind of being outside community in some ways, not fully a product of the places I lived, is that it helps me have a more critical eye when it comes to what's going on. You know, I think about moving to Baton Rouge shortly after Alton Sterling was murdered. And it didn't take me long to recognize, oh, this is where discrepancies exist in this city, right? I will never forget. I was driving, it was raining, I was on Florida, and I was like, oh, this is where it's real. Can I cuss on your
People, yeah, you can.
but this is where the ish gets real. Like, oh, this is the dividing line. And so I think, you know, even Alexandria, I finished high school there, but when I go there, I still feel like a tourist in some ways. So I've never fully been seated any place, I think. And so because of that, I can always kind of like lift myself up a little and kind of look at something from a critical place.
I've mostly grown up in Baton Rouge in terms of my immediate upbringing. But when I was 17, I moved to New Orleans to go to UNO for my undergrad. And then I moved to Vermont, New Hampshire, basically the New England region. I just say New England because I kind of had my experience in grad school shaped in like all these different states of New England. And grew up in North Baton Rouge and ended up north in New England. That's crazy, crazy, crazy. But
Yeah.
I had all these experiences shaped because of my academic journey. And then coming back home, I felt like a transplant. And I felt like because I moved to another place when I was a teenager and then moved back when I was an adult and end up drinking age, I had to rediscover my whole city all over again. And that really
Yeah.
changed what I think about my community. I've always been critical of my own community, but I've never felt more critical than when I moved and saw different parts of the country. I mean, I've lived in New Orleans, I've lived in Baltimore, I've lived in, rural New England. I've visited all these different parts of the country and come back to Baton Rouge. There are some things I see that I would love to see happen in my community that can still feel authentic to my community, but can be more moving it forward.
So like an outsider in position in some ways.
Yes, exactly. I felt a lot of times like I was an outsider with insider knowledge,
Yeah.
and, which has been most of my life. I've always felt like an outsider for most of my life, but I'm from here. I can get from Blunt Road to Hoosier 2 Road with my eyes closed.
I don't
So
even know what those roads are. So whoa.
yeah, exactly. I'm definitely from here in that regard. But let's get back to you. You kind of told me about your geographic journey, your journey and upbringing. But I had a chance to do some research, and I was reading your CV, and I noticed that you have a very dynamic academic journey and a lot of academic writing. So I have a bundled question to ask you. I want you to kind of walk me through your academic journey and maybe your own personal journey towards becoming a faculty member and instructor at LSU, and also walk me through your journey in terms of your academic writings and the different things that you've written for like dissertations or written for graduate research. So just tell me all about that
Okay.
experience.
I'm gonna try to respond to you in earnest. But I am Southern in the sense that I go all down the Mississippi, and so I'm gonna try to get us down and up again, right?
Mm-hmm.
17 years old is when I got the calling to be an educator. I remember it very, very specifically, and I feel very grateful for that because some people spend their whole lives not knowing what their Northern Star is. I got mine at 17. I was volunteering at a vacation Bible school. I was not too much older than the kids I was helping. I was like an assistant for the preteens. So I had like 9 through 12 or something like that. And we did this like a art and craft project where I had the kids clean milk cartons and then tie a balloon and then write a paragraph about where they would go. For the sake of the story, you need to know I'm in Alexandria, Louisiana, which is like what 3 hours away from Houston via the interstate. So, I expected these 9 to 12-year-old kids to talk about Disney World, Disneyland, out of space, SeaWorld, all these outlandish places. Because I said right where you would go in this hot air balloon. And I got some of those, right? I would go to Disney World, I would go to Mars. Um, but then I got this kid who said I would go to the Houston Galleria, right? And again, mind you, I did grow up in New York, right? So in my big town, big city lights mind, I was like, Houston Galleria, that's like 3 hours down the interstate. That's nothing. Um, and then I told, I remember saying, oh, okay, well, let me tell you where I would go. I would go to Venice, Italy. And I remember explaining to the kid like about gondolas and people riding down the street on waterways and so forth and so on. And I remember his face just lit up, like his eyes got bigger the more details I gave. And I remember thinking, this is it. This is what I am created to do, to give people light bulb moments, to help them see the world differently, to help them see themselves bigger. And so that was the start of my journey. I was a super book nerd, so I thought I was going to be a librarian. Like, I'm not going to lie, like for fun, I would read the dictionary. So I was like, this is what it is. I'm going to be a librarian. I'm going to be very, I don't know. But then I'm also like very risk averse. So I just went to the first college that I got a yes from. Like I remember, I was like, they said yes. There you go. They didn't have a library science program. Um, and I started in early education. And it's so funny now when I think about it, because I have such a potty mouth. I can't imagine like just talking to like second graders all day. It would be bad news bears. But I couldn't connect to any of the classes. I really disliked my advisor. I disliked the courses. And now knowing what I know, it makes sense why I didn't like it, right? Because education, like a lot of other uh disciplines in the canon, is very geared towards a very westernized version of education. You know what I'm saying? So I just disconnected and I was like, something's wrong, right? Like, I feel deeply I'm supposed to be an educator, but why am I disconnected from these courses, from this coursework, from these conversations? And then I took my first communication course and I was like, there it is. And so I changed my major. I became a communication studies major, went to grad school for that stuff. And then the natural progression was to teach, right? Because that's what I had signed up for. That was the decision I made at 17. And it created lots of opportunities. And I laugh and think about it, like spending 15 years teaching higher education, which BTW, your girl doesn't look like she's been teaching for 15 years. I'm just saying. No one believes me when I say that. I can look like a college student on any given Sunday, okay? Um, but you know, the idea is this is how I'm transforming the world. And then in terms of like my academic research, I've been very concerned, and it's funny because I want to bring X back into the room. I read the autobiography of Malcolm X in 7th grade, and it stuck with me. And the reason why it stuck with me, and I don't want to juxtapose him with King, but at the time, all those were my reference points for like what Black liberation looked like, right? And so, really, what I loved about reading X's autobiography and having access to it is like, what does it mean to stand up for yourself? But moreover, what does it mean to stand up for others? And so, so much of my teaching and also my writing is like, hey, how do we stand up and advocate for self in a world that constantly finds new ways to be violent towards you? When I think about the publication I did recently with a colleague of mine at LSU, you know, it was a really our relationship at the time was really based on conflict. And once we were able to negotiate that conflict, we were both like, let's talk about this, right? Like, let's talk about the ways that we had to advocate for each other and self in managing a violent system that is XYZ. And so I think that's really what my research and my teaching and my writing has um it's situated in, is again, how does one reflect in a way that makes them see themselves differently, that allows them to have the authority over their own narrative, and then position them for greatness.
You mentioned Black liberation.
Yep.
And that's a word and that phrase, rather, that really brings a lot of power to me. But I feel as though with any term as abstract and broad reaching as it is, people are going to have different definitions of what it is. So, what is your definition of Black liberation?
Okay,
And what
this
would
is the definition today, and I want to say this. If you ask me the same question next week, I might tell you something different, right? So I want to make space for that. I was having this conversation with maybe my mom or someone recently, and I said, I think how I'm seeing equity is different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think before I was just thinking like small, like I just want Black people to like be able to drive safely and not be victims of state sanctioned violence. But now I think I want something more than that. Now I think I want us to be able to make the same kind of decisions, good or bad, that other people make and still live our best lives. And so what I mean by that is, you know what? If I want to go into the grocery store and while out on the cashier over some avocados, guess what? Kina could do that and live to tell the story, right? And so we could laugh about that. You get what I'm saying? So I think for me, liberation is about Black people and the descendants of Africans being able to make whatever choices they want, good, bad, or in between, and still walk away alive and keep it moving. You know what I'm saying? Like I want our spaces, I want our boxes, I want our frame of references to be as big as anyone else's. I want to be able to be mediocre at my job, like no excellence, and still feel confident enough to go up to my boss and be like, when you gonna promote me? And so again, I think for some people that's like funny, ha ha ha. But you know what I'm saying? Like, what does it mean that this happens all the time? That there are all types of like mediocre white guys who like go ahead and demand promotions and raises and aren't great. But that's because they live with this idea that I deserve the best all the time. And so I want that kind of liberation. I want Black people having a posture of demand, demanding promotion, demanding the ability to wow out when they want to, and still walk away and still have leverage in the society that they live in. That's what
So what I
liberation looks like for me.
so what I'm hearing is that Black liberation to you is Black people being able to be seen as human with no constructs that force them to be
Yep.
overly criminalized or overly.
Overly taxed, overly productive, right? Like even thinking about like I know growing up, I've heard it. Kina, if you want to sit at the table, you got to be 100 times better than white folks. You got to be 300 times better than men. I want to be able to show up to the table, and if I'm great, awesome. But not because I feel compelled by these external forces to prove shit to people. I'm
Mhm.
great because I wanted to show up great and I did great shit. The end. You know? And what does it look like to have our full humanity? And I don't think we need to scale it against white people, even though that's what we've been conditioned to do. And I want to make sure I say that out loud. I don't want to scale what I'm doing against anyone at all.
I don't personally take it as an attack against white people or non-Black people. I take it as you simply saying, look, if Black people are able to exist in this world with equity and justice, we have to be okay with being mediocre and it not be an indictment on our standing
Yep,
as people.
exactly. Because it's not all Black people are lazy. It's just Keena's lazy. You
Right.
know? And I just also want to say this out loud. I'm at a place in my life where if like, you know, if people who are not Black, if people who are white or whatever are uncomfortable with my words, that is not on me. That's on them. And that's a whole nother thing too. Like how have we been postured to uplift white comfort? Like that's not gonna get us any closer to Black liberation.
Yeah, yeah. I can say that personally on behalf of myself that a lot of our movement towards racial justice and any sort of advancement for Black people is going to come with us being okay with those hard truths and not
Yeah.
have to be as delicate about how we express those truths because the truth is not always pretty. And what I appreciate about your work and the thing that you do is that you are truly intersectional. Because from a personal standpoint, I see a lot of people talk about Black liberation and Black movement. And to me, on a very personal note, it doesn't seem like Black liberation. It just seems like Black men having the same access to power that white men have or white straight wealthy men have. And
Yeah.
to me, I feel like there's a difference between liberation and supremacy. I don't want to be supreme. I don't think that I'm better
Yes.
than anybody else, but I think that I'm great, but I don't think that I'm better. But I don't want to live in a world where my ability to be empowered is to have power and dominion over other
Yes.
people. I just
Yes.
want to be able to be myself. you know.
Black liberation for Kina has nothing to do with hierarchy. In fact, hierarchy is a product of white supremacy. Why would we want to recreate it?
I want to get into this anti-Blackness reader because, you know, I know that you've been doing, since you've been in Baton Rouge for the last 5 years, you've been doing a lot of community work, but I know that the most visible from you, and I guess your project is the anti-Blackness reader. So what made you create the anti-Blackness reader, and, you know, what kind of work do you do with that project?
So this story is something I've shared a couple times already, and every time I share it, it's still heartbreaking. So 2019, Atiana Jefferson gets killed, and I don't know if you were. There's so many state-sanctioned violent acts against Black people that it's possible you don't even remember this one. But Atiana Jefferson was the Black woman who had been with her nephew playing video games, and then the neighbor had called for a wellness check. Do you remember that outside of?
I vaguely remember that, and I can envision the face and know exactly who she is,
Yeah.
even if I don't know her name. I think that I remember that story.
Yeah, and I mean, how effed is that we have like a Rolodex in our head of Black people and children who've been murdered by the state. But Kina's the type of person that if presented with a problem or issue, my first thing to do is, again, kind of fall back into a book, right? Like that is just like my organic place. Like there's a book for that. There's an answer, right? So Atiana Jefferson gets murdered after a neighbor, a well-intentioned neighbor, calls for a wellness check. The police show up at the house, um, you know, and murder ensues. And so I remember after Atiana Jefferson, I kept thinking, we're missing something. We're missing something. What are we missing? We're missing something. There's a part of this conversation that's not happening. And so I started just heavily relying on text that I had accessible to me. So I was reading both Afrofuturism and Afropessimism, and you know those are like two sides of a conversation that are really important. Like, how do we envision our future outside of white colonial projects, but also like how do we deal with the real time effects of anti-Blackness and the trauma that comes from that, right? So I was reading a lot of this literature, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is what it is. We have been having conversations about racism, and we have been trying to have like articulate that equality has to come about for Black people as a result of racism. And that is great, but that is a limited conversation because we have to handle the fact that anti-Blackness is a real tenet in our global society, which is the belief that people of African descent are not human. And when you tackle that, you're not just dealing with equality, you are dealing with the very question of humanity. And I was like, that's the part of the conversation that there's a gap, and I want to respond to that. And so in 2019, I started having that conversation in my mind, and then thinking about like, how do I return myself to self? Because the truth of the matter is that all types of Black people, whether you're Black from Nigeria or you're Black from Arkansas, or you Blacker in London, have been exposed to the message that Black people are not human. There's data that proves this from the 14th century when the Portuguese, explorers show up to Africa, and they're journaling about Africans, and the ways that they're describing us in those logs are from an animalistic place, right? And that language just gets passed down 14th, 15th century. So by the time the transatlantic slave trade gets up and running, people feel very justified to take us from our homes and enslave us like chattel, because they've had at least 200 years of hearing we're not human. That's where I was like, oh, I need to deal with the internalized anti-Blackness I have. And the Anti-Blackness Reader Project was a conduit for me to do that work. And as I started thinking about what that journey was for me, I realized, hey, I'm not the only person who needs this return to self. Other Black people do too. And that's where the Anti-Blackness Reader kind of manifested from. And so it lived in my brain for about what, 6 months, 6 or 7 months, kind of, sort of. And then in early May 2020, I put it on social media. And then by the end of that month, we had lost George and Aubrey. I mean, Ahmad and Brianna and George. And so then came this flood of people who were ready to have conversations that hadn't been ready before.
I know the summer was very transformational for a lot of us because there were organizations and businesses and companies and groups that never even wanted to touch racism that suddenly wanted to have those conversations more often. I mean, I'm thinking about everybody from ice cream companies to video game companies. I think magazines, people that even like pop stars, like apolitical pop stars, were talking about Black Lives Matter. Like even Celine Dion was talking about Black Lives Matter. And she's like one of the most apolitical celebrities like in the world, apolitical pop stars and vocalists in the world. So everybody was talking about Black Lives Matter, and they were talking about racial justice. And to some people that was great because it meant that more people were on the boat. But for some, you know, who've been doing this work for a while, it was like, we've been doing this for a while, so I guess better late than never. How did you feel having to encounter this new wave of people who wanted to be more enlightened about racism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness after you have spent so much time doing that work?
I think that's a really valid question. I think you kind of like already kind of hit the, the hammer here, which is it was both moving, but simultaneously very, very, I would say, violent. And violent in the sense of a reminder of how far we were removed from that Black liberation, right? And so, I've laughed and joked about this, but I'm like, oh yeah, 2020, racism became real because rich white guys decided it was. And that's something that I've stood on for a very long time. If you want to legitimize something in the global West, just get a rich white guy to say, this is good, right? So I think it was incredibly violent to have so many people say, oh, this thing is real. And like you said, we were all like, what? And, giving honor to George, it was incredibly upsetting as a Black person who lives in the United States, who is the descendants of slaves, to have someone say basically aloud, I didn't believe this thing was true until I saw this thing. And I'm like, Sandra Bland, Tamar Rice, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, what? Do you think George Floyd is the only video that captures Black death? So yeah, I mean, and I still feel some type of weight about it, to be honest. I'm not like I'm not gonna lie. It's just incredibly condescending that in our fight to end racism and in our fight to end anti-Blackness, that it feels like we still need white buy-in to that. And yeah, it's really frustrating. It's very, very frustrating. And then even when you think about like who leads some of those conversations, or going back to this concept of white comfort, and I'm specifically talking about racism because there's multiple violent systems that we live in, right? We live in a world that is like the winter storm, snowpocalypse 2021 highlights so many violent systems, including how anti-poverty this country is, and that's a whole conversation, right? So there are multiple violent systems we live in. We live in a toxic patriarchy. We live in a heteronormative society that increases and places violence on queer bodies. So I want to make space for that. But specifically when I'm talking about racism, anti-Blackness, like, what does it mean that for me to be safe as a Black woman, I've got to convince white people around me to believe that I deserve that safety? That's some bullshit, right? And so, yeah, it makes me angry. And I'm at a point in my life where, like for a very long time, I try to resist that angry Black woman. And then now I'm like, yeah, I'm good. someone wants to read me as angry, I'm good. Because there's a lot of things I have a righteous anger about, you know? And honestly, I think I did a Facebook post about this earlier that said, and people should be angry too, right? Like, I shouldn't be the only person that's angry. Like, again, kind of going back to what we've seen in the last couple of days, every American should be angry. Like, tomorrow I'm gonna make space to like write a letter to the governor of Texas that says, dude, resign. You shouldn't be the governor, period. Like, we should all just be angry at seeing all of these systems fail us. We all should have righteous anger about that. So yeah, I mean, to answer your original question, yeah, it was horrible. It was great in the sense that you're like, okay, there are more people being a part of this conversation. But if you want to be honest about that, I mean, some of those people were allied formatively. At the election at 2020, how many of those people who voted for the non-progressive candidate were people who posted Black squares on their Instagram? No one's ready to have that conversation.
When it comes to these deeper conversations about justice and equity, because I don't really like the word equality, because sometimes you're not going to give a poodle the same amount of food that you give a Rottweiler. And so you have people need as much as they need for the weight of their problems and for their capacity. And so
you couldn't give equality before equity anyway. And I think that's one of the things that, you know, I want to honor our forefathers, our foremothers who were part of the civil rights movement that started in the 1940s in this. But, you know, if I could go back and wave a wand, you know, on Selma that day, I would have been like, change the language. We don't need equality, y'all. We need equity first. Let's get equity first.
But I feel like for our forefathers and foremothers, they needed equality because they weren't getting anything. It's like, there are so many conversations. I don't want to have these particular conversations for this conversation with you. You know, there's a whole conversation about whether or not integration was good for Black people or not. That's a whole other conversation. And then there's also the equity versus equality conversation within our community as Black people. That's not something I want to get into too much, because I want it to be focused on you and what you're doing. But one thing that I hear from you that I feel is very common among a lot of people who talk for Black liberation is that people who are on the outside have their perceptions of it that aren't always, you know, understanding of the pain that comes with advocating for Black identity and this idea of Black liberation. I mean, you have the reverse racism argument, because there's this idea that if Black people advocate for equity and justice, we are trying to assert dominion or supremacy over white people, and that's not the case. Racism is not a system Black people can participate in to disenfranchise anybody at all. And then I'm also hearing that, you know, there are a lot of people who are stepping into the race conversation for the first time. Some of them are genuine, and then some of them, as you're saying, are performative. But there are also a number of people who still feel like talking about racial justice or anything about the dark history of America in this country when it comes to Black people is divisive. I mean, the previous administration set up a whole commission designed to try and stop history that centers marginalized people from being taught in public schools. And if it weren't for the fact that we had an election to change that, that commission would have actually been on the books and been on the payroll doing stuff. So my question to you is specific to the challenges that you face in doing this work, because you have the one challenge that is coming from people outside of our community, and then you have another challenge which comes with the challenges within, because not everybody's intersectional when they're talking about advocating for Black people and the Black race.
Well, let's start with the challenges within. You know, again, this is going to be the third time I'm so drunk that I've managed to put Malcolm X all through this interview. But Malcolm X made, you know, one of his most famous quotes is the least protected person in, you know, America is a Black woman. Yeah. And I would argue if we were to update that, the least protected person in America is the Black trans woman, right? Like, I would update that. You get what I'm saying? And so like the rate of violent crimes and homicide that happens with Black trans women. Forgive me for not like just knowing that data off the top, but it's not safe. You know what I'm saying? I think in terms of within, I think that for a very long time, and I want to be really careful with my words because I don't want to diminish. And I work really hard to make sure I'm not playing what I call oppression Olympics, which is to say that someone else's trauma and oppression matters more than anyone. Because again, hierarchy is a byproduct of capitalism and white supremacy. So what I will say is, I think for so long in the Black community, we've used the Black cisgender male as a signifier of the violence that occurs, right? And rightfully so, right? Because when we think about something like Reagan's administration and the prison industry complex, then Black males have been the target for that specific type of violence, right? So I think we were right to have those kind of conversations and to continue to have those conversations. But I think what our Black mothers and what our Black grandmothers did is, I think what I imagine happened in enslavement, which is 10 wounds of the community without telling they're hurt, all right? The image of our enslaved foremothers cleaning blood after whippings, attending to breaks, abrasions with the limited medical resources that they had, and simultaneously hiding their own pain because they had to keep everyone going. You know what I'm saying? And I think that ethic that Black women have towards care, right, in some ways has created an imbalance, meaning we haven't always known how to articulate our hurt, our trauma. And then there's also the part where anybody who is empowered within a violent system has a hard time seeing forest from the trees. So for example, I'm not a good gender person in the sense that I just woke up one day and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm cisgender, and that comes with privilege and center and safeguards that other people don't have. It is because of the people that I know who are queer, who identify as non-binary, that I have created for myself a desire to know more. That's not organic. And so I think wherever we have dominance in society, whether that's because of our sexual orientation or because our economic status or religious status, you know what I'm saying? We tend to have blind spots. And so in order to have a blind spot, there has to be an awakening, but more than an awakening, there ought to be a sense of accountability. So that means that when a light has turned on for me, right, if someone, hey, Kina, you know, it's safe for all types of Black out here. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, no, like it's not, right? I have to see that and not run from that. So I think when it comes to like that in-group challenge, I think because we all, in some ways, because we live in an anti-world, have so much trauma, it's hard to look for those blind spots where, wait, I have some level of societal level, or I have some level of societal privilege. That can't be possible, right? So I do think the larger in-group challenge we have is kind of establishing where are there blind spots where I don't see the ways that I do have protections. So for example, I'm able-bodied, I'm, you know, a cisgender woman, Christian, in a very Judo-Christian culture, right? And it wasn't organic for me to learn to examine those things, but I've had to. And I think that, again, for people who have some level of dominant leverage, it's hard to examine that because you're also constantly reminded of the trauma of being Black. I also think in terms of out-group challenges here all day. What are some of our challenges outside of the community to right the wrong? Well, again, I've spent a lot of time recently talking about a posture of demand. When you look at some of these older Black, I don't know what to call them, friend. because I look at movies like The Blind Side or Antoine Fisher, and we called those Black movies, but now like that shit ain't for Black folks. I'm not hating, but I'm just saying that's trauma porn. And white creatives have sold us that that's a Black narrative. It features Black people for sure, but this is about Black pain and then like for what sake, like for what gain, you know what I'm saying? So I think part of what we're experiencing outside of the group is that we still have people who are not Black telling our stories. And we have got to get a posture of, oh, I'm not buying it anymore, right? And even to the extent that even if it is a Black creative, like for example, a movie I watched last year that I was very committed to watching and I'm super excited about, and then I left the movie theater like, wah, wah, and it was created by a Black woman, was Harriet. I left the theater feeling not okay. Because I thought to myself, sis, what audience did you make this for? Like, did you make it for the white gays? Or did you make it for us? Because if you made it for us, then why was only 2 film focusing on the fact that Harriet Tubman is one of the first soldiers in United States history to actually be a part of a military like infantry, to lead military raid, like Harriet Tubman history, and not just for helping slaves escape, but like made history, like military history. So I think part of that outside challenge is like, who's telling our stories? And even when Black people are driving the car, who are they driving for? You know what I'm saying? Like what that audience is. And I'm not mad at sis for doing it, because again, I think we've all been conditioned to turn our face to the white gaze. We've been conditioned to respond to white effort, to create white effort. I've done that too. You know? So I think that's another challenge I have to reconcile, is like white people used to telling us our story, and then we're like, okay, that's it. And we're gonna have to push back, and we're gonna have to make demands and we're gonna have to make demands in our art, we're gonna have to make demands in our politics, we're gonna have to make demands in business, like across the board. We have to say, no, we deserve better, we've not gotten better. You know what I'm saying? And that's, think about it. If I'm selling a movie to Hollywood and they're, yes, Kina, we want you to write the screenplay for Richard Pryor's, which by the way, I want to see that in real life. So that is why I'm using very specific example. I don't understand why there's not been a Richard Pryor biopic yet, okay? Hollywood, holla at your girl. And so I get this screenplay, and let's be honest, most of the people in the room are gonna be white execs. And I'm like, this is the story, this is the narrative. And they're like, oh, but what about that? What about that? That'll make white people uncomfortable, blah, blah, blah. And I have to position myself to be like, this is what the Black people who were watching this need to see. I have to be willing to not only make that demand, but I have to be willing to pay the cost that demand doesn't get responded to. Meaning, like, I have to be willing to walk too. And that's what's hard when you live in a capitalist society where people need material goods to be met. And that's a whole nother conversation too. We're not gonna talk about Black capitalism here, because we'll be here all night.
I feel like I want to ask you more questions, but every time you respond, you keep answering all the questions I want to ask. But I think that
I'm sorry.
My thing is sometimes I feel like, I'm not gonna say less is more, because I don't want to say you should stop talking or stop, being in delivering the responses you're delivering, because it's giving me life. What I'm saying more so is like, I feel like you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. It's like you're answering all the questions I would have asked, and also based on our previous conversation, you're also sharing the things that you want to talk about. So as long as you're able to talk about what you want to talk about, then I'm good. We spend a lot of time talking about the challenges, both with the work, what you doing, the work that you're doing, and the work of Black liberation. But I don't want someone to watch this interview and to only think that we are only concerned with challenges. Black people are also concerned about wanting to accomplish dreams and ambitions.
Yeah, Black joy is a real thing.
Yeah, so talk to me about what's your overall vision for the work you want to do and what you want to accomplish with the anti-Blackness reader. Like what will be some things that you would love to have as an end result?
Okay, so depending on what day you're talking to Kina, right? Is it a day where I'm a systems person, or is it a day where I'm an abolitionist?
Well, today at 6:59 p.m. on a what is your response to that question?
You know, I watched Judas and the Black Messiah during the Winter Storm. Amazing film, amazing, just amazing. And I was thinking about some of the lines in that film, which is like, reform is just another type of slavery, and it's like, whoa, right? You know, like, are we asking again, kind of like, are we asking for the right thing? The Reconstruction era is a fascinating place in the United States history. It's also really fascinating for Louisiana history. Louisiana in 2021 has 64 parishes. At least 13 of those were created in Reconstruction, right? You know, if there was ever a place that Reconstruction should have been powerful, it was in Louisiana. And we have things like the Colfax massacre that occurred in central Louisiana that highlighted just how not only how violent white supremacy was, but how afraid white people were of what like a Black community ethic would mean for racial justice and equality. And so I say that to say Reconstruction failed. That is not news to you or anybody else, right? Because we're still here. But I think when I think about Reconstruction, I mean, this is the stuff that keeps me up at night, Reconstruction. When I think about the Reconstruction era and the Freedmen's Bureau that was set up to be that interventionist strategy for Black folks who were just been like, they're no longer enslaved, right? But they don't have access to education, to healthcare, to jobs, you know what I'm saying? So the Freedmen's Bureau existed to be this conduit of change, and it failed, right? And we can understand why it failed. We can talk about like why, you know, Jackson, okay, I don't want to get into political history, but in 2021, asking, why isn't there a Department of African American Affairs yet? African American Affairs yet? So if you're talking about what a win looks like for Kina, who's thinking from a systems approach, it looks like that's finally happening, right? And that's not the only solution, because there's a Department of Native American Affairs, and we still see the violence that Indigenous people experience every day, right? But a Department of African American Affairs is at least a place to start from a policy position that is creating targeted policy that would allow for racial equity, which also allows for environmental justice, which also allows for educational justice, also allows for all these other things, right? So that's what a win looks like. It looks like platforms created that respond to the things that Black people need. And it kind of goes back to something I've said before, which is we've got to get a posture of demand and not feel bad about asking some stuff for us. I don't think we know how to do that well. And so that's what it looks like for me. It looks like something like the Department of African American Affairs existing. It looks like people saying, hey, there's a lot going on and we appreciate everything that's going on, but this is the thing we need. Because, you know, one of the metaphors I often make is that if you're a good parent, right, then you realize that all your parents have different needs. I mean, you realize all kids have different needs at different times to respond to each of them. And you don't treat them all like they're the same person. So that's what I think a win looks like for me right
I didn't even think of a concept of a Department for African American Affairs, but that doesn't seem outlandish to me by any means. I feel like that's completely warranted because of the fact that there's so much history of Black people giving so much to this country and not getting a lot back in return. And even though we are not necessarily, we are the third largest ethnic group in the United States, our history here, and in addition to the history of Indigenous Americans in this country, are literally intersected with the foundation of this country, which is not something that immigrant groups share, because Black and Native people were like oppressed as a part of the foundation of this country.
Exactly.
Other communities came after that. I think that there has to be an actual systemic effort into reconciling those wrongs. We talked a lot about the whole process of Black liberation. And what I often find is that a lot of mainstream organizations that focus on like African American issues don't always do the best job of ensuring that Black women's concerns are faced, especially in our community, that there are not a number of organizations that focus on Black women's issues, or in the same token, they see Black women's issues as so drastically different from Black men's issues to where they can't be
overlapped
at the same times. Like, for example, a commission on Black men, or like commission to study improving the lives of Black men. I'm like, well, a lot of the issues that young Black boys face are very similar to the issues that young Black girls face.
Like adultification in our schools.
Right.
Black children are not seen as children very long. That's Black girls, that's Black boys. It happens at a different time frame. We see adultification happen for Black girls as early as 9, and that adultification manifests itself in over-sexualizing them. And then around 11, we see that adultification happening with Black boys, which explains why Tamar Rice gets shot by police officers for walking around with a toy gun. So that's an issue that overlaps. I'm sorry, I got super excited when you said that, but I was like, that's a very specific overlapping issue.
No. Do not apologize, because that's because literally that's a good build up to my question, the actual question. I often feel as though Black organizations can do a better job of centering, or at least including Black women's issues, and not treating them as like something that's separate and independent, or something that, in other words, if you address Black women's issues in the same way you address Black men's issues, you also are uplifting Black people as a whole.
Yes.
So how can organizations that are Black oriented and are focusing on uplifting Black people, how can they learn to center Black women in their work more often in a way that isn't just like tokenistic, but also intentional and impactful?
I'm going to answer your question, but I'm not going to answer it directly. So
okay.
I'm going to bring Joe Biden into the conversation. Thought about this, like, how will Joe govern for the whole of the United States? How will Joe govern for the whole of the United States? How will he be the president for all the people that voted for him and all the people who didn't? And the answer is he can't. He can't. There's too many splits, too many divides, too much stuff. But what would it look like if he governed for the least of these? What if it looked like if he governed for the least protected? What would it look like if he governed for the people who have the least amount of safety nets? And that's the answer. You build policy, you build process, and you build infrastructure that protects the people who have the least in our society. And that is the opposite of trickle down. Trickle down economics, trash. All right. So once we start creating process, infrastructure, and policy for the least protected in our communities, then we'll see society flourish as a whole. So that's it. That's it. We have to stop thinking about who already has wins, and we've got to redirect our energy to the person who has the least amount. And that's how we all get on top of things.
Yeah, I will allow that non-answer to my question. It was a very beautiful and eloquent and powerful non-answer. So I will allow that.
Thank you.
I cannot allow you to non-answer this question. You have had a lot of jobs and you've done a lot of research and you do a lot of work, which means that you often have this issue where you interview or are interviewed and you're like, man, I should have asked that question. Man, I didn't get to talk about this. Man, I wish I talked about this more. Did I say that? I wish I didn't say that. I really want to I wish I said this instead. So I want to give you the opportunity to share any final thoughts or wrap up thoughts that you have before I conclude this interview.
You're really good at this. I think the only final thought I would have is to remind people, part of my decolonization journey, and that, it's a whole nother conversation. But I had to realize we have to make space for each other. There are lots of places in my life where I was judging Black people for how they chose to secure the bag, or you know what I'm saying. And I realized, because of the very violence of living in an anti-Black world, that I didn't have the indulgence of judging, critiquing how Black people survive it. So the thing I would say is that we need to spend more time in community understanding, not policing cases, where that's like when someone chooses to vaccinate. We need to spend time celebrating why. Why does this person feel like gang violence and affiliation is the answer? Why does this person feel like my vote doesn't count? And so we've got to figure out how to really lead whys, because I think we make a lot of assertions about what people are doing, but we don't make a lot of assumptions about why. So that's something I would encourage. So that's one of the things I've had to do. I see Black people doing stuff that I'm like, ooh, this, like, oh, why? And I've had to learn how to pause, ... I wonder why. Not signing on it, right? Not subscribing to the behavior, but just being like, I need to understand a deep why here. So I would just encourage us to create that. I would also say, again, I know I said this earlier, but we've got to figure out how to come together and make decisions outside of the white gaze. Because I think a lot of the do happen in the spaces of white approval, white acceptance, white comfort. We do not get to the peace of liberation if it's our ultimate value. That is not to say that we're out here being like, white people, you can get it. That's not what I'm advocating for. But if we're gonna see the work we need to happen, then we've got to learn to be like, we're ruffling feathers. That's normal. Let's keep it going.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to understand that the civil rights movement is seen as a respectable movement, but at the time it was not popular.
Oh my gosh, I heard a radio announcement like, today we want to honor Malcolm X, blah, and I'm like, y'all, like, real life, like, dude needs to die. And the same thing with King. That's why I always tell people, Dr. Martin Luther King was on FBI's like terrorist list. That was the thing,
And also, Dr. King was actually, a lot of misconceptions that people had about him. Dr. King was actually an ally to Malcolm X. They weren't enemies. They were actually two people that respected each other's vision. They may have had disagreements, but they all respected each other and saw value. And ironically, actually Malcolm X and Dr. King kind of changed their perspectives. They almost like switched, like had a Freaky Friday moment. Yeah. And Dr. King actually was towards the end of his life became a lot more radical in terms of,
and more intersectional too. That's another thing, right? Yeah, a lot of people miss that. I was like, Dr. King was one of the first modern writers who actually advocated for a universal living wage. Like, that's the thing.
And also another thing to kind of insert, we've been talking a lot about men, but also let's insert ladies. Coretta Scott King actually, after Dr. King's death and even during his lifetime, was a very profound activist. And she was not only intersectional within Black issues, but also with other communities. Coretta Scott King was an ally to the Latino workers' rights movement, and she was an ally to Cesar Chavez. Also, she was one of the earliest proponents for LGBTQ rights.
Yes, I was just about to say, don't forget queer people who were making moves during that time who erased from that narrative.
Yeah, and so like I think that, when we think about just that history, we have to think about the fact that the work that we've been doing didn't just start, it's always been there.
Yes. I tell people, Kina's not saying anything that Harriet Tubman didn't say.
Right. And I'm not saying anything that Audre Lorde didn't say. And I will end my part of this by saying one of my favorite quotes from Audre Lorde, which I always feel is a big clap back to anybody that's like, well, why y'all focus on these people? Why are you not focused on? I'm like, there is no hierarchy of oppression. There is no hierarchy of oppression.
It is not.
We're all struggling with this system of oppression. If you want to fight one specific oppression, cool, but this isn't a competition. We're not trying to, this isn't America's Next Top Oppression. We're trying to get to the other side together. But I'm gonna end it there because we can literally talk forever. So me and you are gonna have to talk at some other point that isn't on a recorded Zoom call or whatever. Mm-hmm. But Kina, it was such a pleasure being able to talk to you. I love being able to sit down with you and hear your insights as opposed to hearing you answer like, a question during a dialogue or be on a panel, actually talk to you. I enjoyed that much. And I will continue to follow the work that you all are doing with the Anti-Blackness Reader, and I encourage those of you who are watching this interview to also go to Anti-Blackness Reader and follow, Kina's work, because even if you are not Black, this is still of importance to you because Black history is American history.
There you go.
My whole thing is, if you want to know your history as an American, you also have to know the naked truth about Black history and the things that we've experienced.
You mean the people who the country?
Yes, exactly. the builders of the country. But yeah, Kina, it was
the country.
Talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
I know the pleasure is mine. I really appreciated being able to interview you, and I'm glad that you came on here to expand my roots to the world and expand everybody else's too.